Hi friends, I'd like to welcome you back to Defining Virtuosity, and today I'd actually like to start putting together some of the different elements that we've been discussing in the right hand and the left hand in practical application. About 7 years ago, I was privileged to give master classes at the Juilliard School, my alma mater, for the Starling Delay Symposium, and the topic that I chose was something called Lost in Translation, Demystifying the Principles of Ivan Galamian in Practical Application. And the study and work that I had done was in taking the sort of dogmatic and strict rules that we see in the book, Principles of Violin Playing and Teaching, and examining them through two filters that I felt a lot of Galamian assistants and followers didn't observe. And those were the filters of comfort and results, so that we could adjust angles and positions according to those two filters, comfort and result, in percentages. So that if we were thinking about figure eights in the bow arm, if we're thinking about going out and in and all of this stuff, that we might want to examine, well, what is the overall range of that figure eight? Is it from here to here? Is it from here to here? And in terms of other actions of the hand, how much do we pivot to cross a string? What do we do? And how do we measure all of that? And basically what I started off by telling people was that I thought a lot of hungry young students were so in awe of these professors that they came in and effectively hung their talent on the door and stopped observing in the lesson if they were comfortable or not, and if they were getting the result and the sound that they wanted. And I was a little bit more stubborn and obstinate, and if I didn't feel comfortable, I questioned, and sometimes I got in trouble for it. But I'm glad I did. And I had a very good teacher who helped me to understand a lot of things. And we sometimes would discuss and argue back and forth, but it was always very, very healthy, I thought. The other thing that I used as a teaching element was a very specific piece. And there's a story behind it. There are two stories behind it. One about a first protege of Ivan Galamian's, and the second about my first encounters with Sally Thomas, my teacher that taught me from when I was 11 until I was 22. In a very small and lesser known book about Ivan Galamian called Ivan Galamian, Miraculous Teacher and the Metamount Experience by Elizabeth Green, there is reference to a time when Galamian came to Paris and all of a sudden stopped performing. And the press was wondering where Mr. Galamian had disappeared to, because his first concerts in Paris were met with actually great critical acclaim. The next we hear of him, however, is in the introduction of his first protege, a violinist named Paul Makinovitsky. And he taught Paul from the very beginning, when Paul was so tiny that he had to be up on a counter so that he'd be tall enough for Galamian not to tower above him, because Galamian was quite tall. And in that little book is a program from Makinovitsky's first recital. And on that is the Largo and Allegro of Veracini. And it gives great insight to Galamian technique, at least in terms of my understanding of it, from the chapter on the right hand, of all the fundamental strokes, and came into my life shortly after I got into Juilliard in 1977, when all of a sudden Miss Thomas gave me this piece, and I had to learn all these strokes in a very specific manner that I had never been so disciplined or thoughtful about before. All of the notions of catch and release, and how to do a détaché, how to do string crossings, how to do a dropped spiccato or a spiccato that comes from the string, how the arm feels as we cross the four strings from the E to the G naturally in terms of at the shoulder, and how our arm should feel left to right. All of these things came into play. And I want to demonstrate some of the things that I had to learn in this piece. If you want to print out the music of the Veracini Allegro in A major, it comes from the 10th Sonata, Largo and Allegro, and there's an old Russian edition on IMSLP that you can print out, and then you can try the various things that that I'm demonstrating here. But for review from the actions of the right hand in terms of passive and active actions, this notion of the collé of a catch, where we just catch the string like this with the fingers a little bit, yeah, and where we can either pull the bow into the hand or shoot it out, plucks the string. The other thing to remember when we do that is that the thumb is involved. It's bending, and the fingers are curling or straightening more. And remember I said that could happen actively and passively. So we can pull, and it'll bring the hand into that more pulled shape. That's almost the same shape as the end of an up bow collé, but now it's passive motion. I pulled, and that puts a little bit of a load in the collé, so that when we release it, we get the plucking of the string. Years later, when Galamian turned 75, there was an article in the Cleveland Plain Dealer saying that while we've not heard Mr. Galamian, we feel that we have, because we've heard the trademark articulation and sound production of so many of his wonderful proteges. And they brought up some of these points. The first opening of the Allegro begins with a pattern of changed notes on the A string, followed by crossings to the E string. From the actions of the right hand, we drop slightly to the E string, trying to keep the bow hair flat. We push out on the down bow and in on the first up bow. We answer each of the melody notes with a simple figure, and we get and then we prepare the next chords. The next chords are double stops between the D and A and E string. And the left hand is very simple. With the upper strings in between. Here, Miss Thomas wanted my motions from the outer strings to be very smooth, but the catches to be very clear with the bow. Also, if you have a friend in the room with you, they ought to be able to put their hand under your elbow and feel your arm weight the whole time. Because if you're carrying your arm weight up this way, you won't get a good sound. The arm should feel at rest downward, the wrist slightly higher than the elbow, and the elbow joint completely free to open and close. The next stroke is similar to the first set of measures, except on the bottom three strings, and can be executed two different ways. If you look in your original, it is either separate, or even harder, slur, separate, slurred, slurred. To be honest, I studied it when I was 11 with her, and I can't remember which she made me do, but I've practiced both since. They have good benefits because the one with the slur is quite awkward and forces us to be aware of one of the other actions of the hand, the balance between the pinky side of the hand on down bows and the index side, the more pronation and supination that we feel. And there's a great deal of that from the frog to the very tip, but there's also a slight fraction of that at any change to a down bow or any change to an up bow. There's a fractional amount of that. Remember I said that at these master classes, I wanted to teach comfort and result and the fractional application of values rather than something that just says, this is what you do on a down bow or an up bow, done, finished. I think that's too rigid, and it disengages the student from thinking about the two most important things. Are they comfortable, and do they like what's coming out of the axe? This is very important. So we now have these few techniques that are combined. And that I should have practiced slower because, to be honest, you want every note to be clean across. To clean that, I suggest martelets ending on the next string. Drop, lift, drop. You know, from the outer strings, feel the outer motion smooth. Drop, lift. And help a little bit with the fingers. Try not to do too much of this though, raising the whole forearm above the elbow, because that actually leads to rotation at the shoulder joint in a way that's not healthy, and you'll feel tension in the back of your shoulder if you do that. You want to isolate this horizontal motion, use the shoulder primarily to raise between the outer strings, but help a little bit to shorten that distance with the fingers. That I've found keeps the wrist hinge loose. You can think of the way we waving to the queen, some people say, that the horizontal motion in the wrist and fingers has to be very free for the elbow to open and close. If the wrist locks, the thumb locks, the wrist lock. If the wrist locks, the elbow locks. If the elbow locks, the shoulder locks. Kind of like I knew an old lady who swallowed a fly. So when we then have completed that, you can practice that in martelet. All of you can be practiced this way. Or but you want to make sure that you're comfortable during that grab. And the pivot is so important. The ability to go from here without changing the arm height. When you're on two adjacent strings, that first passage should feel essentially like it's this. And then you should be able to decide how much bow you want to do so that you can shape it. And again, here, make sure that two things are prepared at once. This, the string crossing meets the first finger crossing to the fifth. Release the left hand and gently meet. Don't lurch. It's quick, but not lurch. We don't jerk over there, but we have to anticipate so that by the time we move here, we have this in place and we're properly on the plane. This is why you're going to watch the sounding point like a hawk. You watch it like a hawk and you feel your arm freedom. You don't have to look at your arm. You can do that in the mirror later. You can do subjective practice, but you watch that sounding point. Also give the bow the best working conditions by not having it down or like this, but having enough of an angle upward to the fiddle where the strings are flat over the floor. That's what my uncle used to tell me anyway. And again, that's not a hard and fast rule, but because I don't want you to over raise your shoulders or get uncomfortable. But in as much as you're able to, keeping the scroll slightly above this, and having a concept that the fiddle is relatively high and that your neck is straight and your shoulders down and back. For me, it gets rid of a lot of pain and discomfort because your body's more in alignment. There's some good teachers online that talk from a very Alexander technique or Dalcroix's perspective on this matter. And I would not rule out their teaching just because they don't talk enough about the specifics of technique. I'd say that both go hand in hand and use them together. So now we've gotten to the point where we have in the music, okay? And you can use the inked program or a different one. I think I usually go back to the other technique. Catch. You know, in Veracini Allegro we use the same stroke. In Tchaikovsky, you can practice catching like that, so that it's very clear. So now we come back to that bowing again. Now he introduces the opening theme again. The next thing is a series of sequences, Baroque sequences. You have harmonically. So we have followed by lyricalness. Here are and now a higher level of power, yeah. More lyricism growing. Another level. Now a little word of advice about the catches. A bad habit that I used to have in terms of exaggerating Galamian technique, and this is a real misconception, is to push out immediately on the... That's wrong. At the moment of sounding point, the bow should be perpendicular to the string. So make sure that you're not like this at the start. After we've started a sound, you can do whatever you like to alter the color. But at the moment of sound, the sounding point, it's really ideal if we can have the bow at 90 degrees to the string. It's a misconception. It also leads to the shoulder getting uncomfortable this way. So if you back up your starting points for these catches, you'll get a much cleaner sound. Also the legato's there. It's more in than you think when you start the down bow. Yeah? And you can hear it in the sound. You can measure it with your ear. Now we're at probably one of the first loudest moments in the work when you want to really open up the arm. We have groupings of 3 plus 1. 3, light, heavy, light. Now the reverse less. Except for the last 4 that we're going to do up so that we can start the triplets that follow down bow. Here, make sure the triplets are not too slow. And also feel a little bit of swing on the downbeats of the measure. Now here, this motion is taught very clearly by Mr. Galamian in Kreutzer number 27. It's also important for grabbing fugue notes. Do you see the pivot? How I do that? It prevents a lurch. There, and grab from that point, okay? If you don't do that, we start seeing people do this, and they're praying. They're doing something with their spine that they should be doing with their arm. Lead with the elbow, catch up with the fingers on the lower string. And again, take it from further in than you think. In terms of the 5 actions of the bow, what I mean is, when we discussed the windshield wiper, the bow will very often be too much this way and we'll get a bad sound. It won't be parallel to the bridge, which is here. So the windshield wiper will feel like you've moved the stick this way. And you'll observe with your eye, oh yeah, that's straight. And then you bend the thumb and you can let the whole arm move one direction. Again here. This has to meet. Then later on, you can do it very baroque if you want to have a non-accented thing, but you still use that same thing that you would use in catch and release. So I don't want to become dogmatic in the sense that it has to be so angular in the attack all the time. That's a means to an end. Once you're there, you can do it legato. Always pivot. Catch. Curl the fingers. Yeah? It shortens the distance. You'll do much less flopping around with your arm. And you can just hang. Hemiola here. How do we mark the hemiola? We mark the hemiola with vibrato, vibrato, trill. Sing, sing, trill. Then subito piano. So. Little version now. Probably the softest of any of the times that we play it, because we're now going up towards the climax of the piece. All right, so we want to be weak enough here. It's a good time to experiment between transitioning loosely between strokes. Instead of thinking that we just have an off-the-string spiccato or a complete on-the-string, you can mix things where you're almost bouncing. Just barely on. Now I end this down and change this to an up bow, but I whip it, give it power, a little whip. Whipping brings in that other fundamental action we discussed about, you know, doing either from the fingers or from the elbow a rotation. In this case, I do not recommend doing it from the elbow. Do it from your fingers so that your elbow stays relaxed and ready to close when you catch it. So just use the balance of the fingers from the index to the thumb, yeah, to catch the string. Here, whip, follow the musical line, up, up, vibrate a little bit that note, and that gets the most pivot, the most bow after the pivot. So I had to whip, pivot, more. Again, not dogmatically just doing. You can do that in the practice room to really feel the strokes out and in that you're pushing out and in. But we have to always bear in mind the artistry at the end, that this is a means to an end, right? So a line. In the left hand, I like to remember as I'm getting louder here not to tighten anything up, because I want to keep the vibrato patterns free. Everything rubbery. slapping the fingers. Very legato fingering feeling and rounded. The first joint's collapsible and not too much finger pressure. Then he has down, up, up, down, up to end. I like using to use Galamian system for fingering. Start in third position, squared 2 and 3. Okay, I moved them up a half step. So now I'm here. Once the fingers are there, release the back of the hand and it'll come up to the new position. And then release the 3. On this release, make sure that this finger lifts this way and not back into the first finger. This way. Good springiness. That will set into motion the vibrato of the first finger. I use a harmonic there. And again, be careful not to lift your hand, unrotating the hand and drawing the base of the index finger into the neck. Keep the hand turned and isolate the lifting of this way so that the hand can vibrate. If you go back into the neck, you'll get muscular trying to vibrate that note because you've locked your hand right here. And for any vibrato to happen, this has to be free to move at the wrist joint. There, at the wrist. So, just some observation. Now, we're at the loudest moment, okay? And he comes down in terrace dynamics as well. I would use consonant-dissonant harmony relationships to choose where to crescendo and diminuendo. We have this harmony for a bar, and then this. This has more tension. More. So we could do. And again, don't be afraid to become very soft as long as you don't let the bow slip. No foo-foo fluffy, but make sure it's very clear and articulate. This is followed by a further singing. So here we have the first figure. Make sure that you're really isolating that. When you do it slowly, push your bow arm out and in. You won't see me doing that in concert. It's probably, I've moved the figure 8 a little bit inward and I'm hanging more. And I use a smaller range of motion. But that motion of stretching the bicep is really, really healthy to get your bow Galamianized. So then we have the string crossings. For a measure. I would diminuendo, okay? And then we have down with 3 up bow slurs, okay? Sing. Okay? And this, meeting your double stop, 4 and 2, and the bow, meeting. In your mind, meet, no sound. Again, here you meet. Lead with the arm, finish with the fingers, and the fingers are down before the sound. This is going back to that old adage in Suzuki. I was a Suzuki kid too, when I was much younger, of the rule, remember? Finger, bow, go. I think it's really great. I had a lesson with a Heifetz student when I was about 22 or 23, and he said something that was almost really offensive to me because it sounded dismissive. I was having problems, you know, this passage from here in Isai Ballad. And he said, well, Odin, why don't you try to have your fingers a little closer to the next notes they have to play? And I really felt like he was just making fun of me. I didn't know whether to laugh or be pissed off. But it took me almost 3 or 4 days to realize, wait, he's onto something. So what does that mean? Well, if your hand is in a position where the 10th is blocked and the finger dock is and close to this one and this one, it's probably going to work better. So what are the outer intervals there? Tenths, right? We have. So I started doing that for a while and relaxing my arm and figuring out softly where everything goes. And all of a sudden the passage became a lot easier. So this idea of having the fingers and the bow ready before sound can be introduced to artists with much easier repertoire. And Miss Thomas did it to me with this Veracini Allegro. So you always end where you're next going to be. I lifted this as I caught the A and E string. Then I went to the D and A string and have the third finger down. Because this finger is now already down, it can release, it can vibrate when I move the bow. But so in many ways, we have to prepare things an instant before we hear them so that we're actually ready to release. If we do this at the moment the metronome strikes, our vibrato is going to be late. It's psychological. But by doing this, everything becomes slower, and you end up with. And there you have it, the Veracini Allegro in A major. This will change your bow arms if you practice it patiently in the way I just demonstrated. I promise. If it could work for me, it can work for anybody. This is not about talent. This is about just common sense. It's why Galamian was such an amazing, amazing teacher. I hope you enjoyed this video. This is the first of the more instructional ones with real repertoire. You'll see 4 or 5 later tonight. If you like my channel, share it, subscribe, and tell friends about it. I'd like to help as many people as I possibly can. Have a great evening.